He boarded the flight as just another passenger, but within hours he would own the entire airline. What happened in those tense minutes between an insult and a takeover left everyone on the plane stunned, and one flight attendant questioning everything. Before we start the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to their gates, the soft hum of announcements blending with the chatter of the crowd. Among the sea of faces was Elliot Parker, a calm and sharply dressed man in his early 40s. He stood in the corner of the first-class lounge, his dark-tailored suit and polished shoes, subtly reflecting the sophistication of someone who was no stranger to success. Elliot didn't flaunt his wealth. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his leather briefcase resting at his side. His focus was on his phone as he reviewed a string of emails, occasionally typing out quick responses with practiced ease. Elliot was not just another traveler. Behind his calm exterior lay the mind of a business powerhouse. His company, a leader in aviation technology, had revolutionized the way airlines operated, but none of that was obvious in his demeanor. To anyone watching, he was just another businessman heading to his next meeting. He glanced up briefly at the clock, noting that it was almost time for boarding. With a calm sigh, he closed his email app and tucked his phone into his pocket, grabbing his briefcase as he headed toward the gate. The boarding process was smooth, as expected for first-class passengers. Elliot handed over his boarding pass and was greeted warmly by the gate agent. "Have a pleasant flight, Mr. Parker," they said with a genuine smile. He nodded politely, appreciating the courtesy. As he stepped onto the plane, he was greeted by the head flight attendant, who directed him to his seat in the spacious first-class cabin. Elliot moved gracefully, aware of the curious glances from a few passengers who noticed his composed presence. He found his seat by the window and settled in, placing his briefcase neatly under the seat in front of him. The space was luxurious, the leather seat reclined comfortably, and a welcome drink had already been placed on the side table. Elliot pulled out his tablet and began reviewing some notes, his focus shifting to an upcoming business proposal. The hum of the other passengers faded into the background as he immersed himself in his work. But his peace was short-lived. A flight attendant approached, her name tag reading, Linda Carson. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her hair neatly tied back, but her expression carried a stiffness that was hard to ignore. She stopped beside Elliot's seat, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at him. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a tone that was polite on the surface but carried an unmistakable edge. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Elliot looked up, his calm eyes meeting hers. "Yes, this is my seat," he replied, his voice steady and polite. Linda frowned, clearly unsatisfied with his answer. "Can I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her tone sharper now. Around them, a few passengers turned their heads, sensing the tension. Elliot reached into his jacket pocket and handed her the boarding pass without hesitation. Linda studied it for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. She muttered, handing it back. "Well, just so you know, first-class passengers need to adhere to specific guidelines. Let us know if you need help understanding anything." Her words were coated with a thin layer of condescension that didn't escape Elliot's notice. He raised an eyebrow slightly but chose not to respond, instead placing his boarding pass back into his pocket. Linda lingered for a moment before walking away, her heels clicking sharply on the carpeted aisle. Elliot returned to his notes, but a faint crease had appeared on his otherwise calm face. The interaction, though brief, had left a strange undercurrent in the air. He could feel the eyes of other passengers darting toward him, their whispers too faint to catch, but their curiosity unmistakable. Elliot, however, remained composed, his focus unwavering, though he couldn't ignore the peculiar shift in the atmosphere. As the plane began boarding the remaining passengers, Linda's presence lingered in the first-class cabin, her movements quick and deliberate. She busied herself attending to other passengers, flashing polite smiles that felt hollow after her earlier interaction with Elliot. From his seat, Elliot observed her, not with anger, but with a quiet curiosity. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but her tone and mannerisms left a lingering question in his mind. The rest of the first-class passengers settled in, each welcomed by Linda, with a warmth that starkly contrasted her earlier coldness toward Elliot. A middle-aged man in a blazer across the aisle exchanged a brief glance with Elliot, raising an eyebrow as if silently acknowledging the unusual interaction. Elliot offered a faint smile in return, his expression betraying no sign of unease. When drink service began, Linda approached each passenger in turn, offering beverages and snacks with practiced politeness. She moved steadily through the rows, yet when she reached Elliot's seat, she hesitated. For a moment it seemed as though she would speak to him directly, but instead, she moved on to the next passenger without so much as a glance in his direction. The man across the aisle leaned slightly toward Elliot once Linda was out of earshot. "Did she skip you?" he whispered, his voice low but curious. Elliot gave a small nod, his expression calm. "It seems so," he replied simply, his tone neutral. He didn't want to make a scene, not yet. Linda continued her rounds, returning once more to the first-class cabin with a tray of warm towels. This time, Elliot decided to address the issue. As she approached his row, he lifted his hand slightly to signal her attention. "Excuse me," he began, his voice polite but firm. "I believe I was skipped during drink service. Could I have some water, please?" Linda froze for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at him. Her response came quickly but with a curt edge. "I'll get to it when I can," she said, her words clipped. Without waiting for a reply, she walked past him again, leaving behind a faint air of tension that spread like a ripple through the cabin. The man across the aisle shook his head in disbelief, leaning toward Elliot once more. "What's her problem?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elliot gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "Maybe she's having a bad day," he said, his tone even. But the tight grip on his tablet told another story. Though his exterior remained composed, something had shifted within him. He wasn't the type to let things slide, especially not when it came to respect and professionalism. Linda, meanwhile, disappeared into the galley, where she exchanged a few quiet words with another flight attendant. Her tone was low, but her body language betrayed her unease. She glanced toward the first-class cabin, her expression tightening as she caught sight of Elliot sitting quietly by the window. Whatever was on her mind, it was clear that she wasn't done. The cabin settled into a comfortable rhythm as the flight prepared for takeoff. Passengers adjusted their seats, stowed their belongings, and scrolled through in-flight entertainment options. Elliot remained quiet in his seat, his gaze shifting occasionally from the window to his tablet, though his focus was clearly elsewhere. His composed demeanor masked the growing frustration beneath the surface, but he stayed calm, choosing his next move with care. Linda returned to the first-class cabin a short while later, her posture stiff as she walked down the aisle. She avoided eye contact with Elliot, but it was impossible not to notice her lingering glances in his direction. Her behavior, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed by the other passengers. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin, low murmurs of confusion and unease. A flight attendant named Rachel, younger and seemingly more empathetic, entered the cabin to assist with service. She smiled warmly as she worked her way through the rows, ensuring everyone had what they needed. When she reached Elliot's seat, she paused, noticing the untouched tray table in front of him. "Sir, would you like something to drink or eat?" Rachel asked, her voice kind and professional. Elliot looked up, his expression softening at her courteous tone. "Just water, please," he replied. Rachel nodded and quickly returned with a glass of water, placing it gently on his tray. "If you need anything else, don't hesitate to let me know," she added with a smile. "Thank you," Elliot said simply, his gratitude genuine. The exchange was brief, but it was enough to catch Linda's attention. She stood near the galley, watching with a tight-lipped expression as Rachel attended to Elliot. Her posture grew stiffer, her irritation barely concealed. The calm didn't last long. Moments later, Linda returned to Elliot's row, this time with a more assertive demeanor. She leaned slightly toward him, her tone low but sharp. I need to verify something about your seat. Could you step into the galley for a moment? Elliot's brows furrowed slightly, though his calm never wavered. Is there an issue with my seat? He asked, his voice steady. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. It's just a routine check, she said curtly. Elliot hesitated, sensing the tension in her tone, but he stood nonetheless, taking his briefcase with him as he followed her into the galley. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers exchanged puzzled glances. It wasn't often that someone was asked to leave their seat for a routine check. Once inside the galley, Linda turned to face Elliot, her expression cold. I've noticed some irregularities and I need to confirm whether your seat was booked correctly, she said, her words deliberate. Elliot's calm expression hardened ever so slightly. Irregularities, he repeated. I presented my ticket when I boarded. What exactly are you questioning? Linda hesitated, her eyes darting away briefly before returning to him. There are certain standards for first-class passengers, and I need to ensure everything is in order, she said vaguely, her tone teetering on the edge of hostility. Elliot's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. If there's a specific issue, I'd appreciate it if you addressed it clearly, he said. Otherwise, I'd like to return to my seat. Linda didn't respond immediately, her silence betraying her uncertainty. She glanced toward the cabin where curious eyes peeked over seats to catch a glimpse of the unfolding situation. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed Linda's face. It was subtle, but it was there. Elliot noticed it too, and though he said nothing, the faintest hint of a knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The tension in the galley was palpable, but Elliot gave Linda no further satisfaction. With a calm but firm tone, he said, If you're done with your routine check, I'd like to get back to my work. Without waiting for her response, he stepped past her and returned to his seat, leaving Linda standing alone in the galley, her confidence visibly shaken. Elliot returned to his seat, adjusting his briefcase under the seat in front of him with deliberate calm. The murmurs around the first-class cabin grew louder as passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued by the unusual interaction. The man across the aisle leaned toward Elliot once again, his voice low but concerned. Everything all right over there? He asked, his tone friendly but cautious. Elliot offered a polite nod. Everything's fine, he replied, though his tone carried a subtle weight. His calm demeanor hadn't faltered, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes now, a clear signal that he wasn't taking the situation lightly. Linda reappeared moments later, her expression tense as she resumed her duties. She avoided eye contact with Elliot, but her unease was evident in her stiff movements and clipped tone when addressing other passengers. The whispers in the cabin became harder to ignore, and even the other flight attendants seemed to sense the mounting tension. The younger flight attendant, Rachel, approached Elliot's row again, this time with visible hesitation. She leaned in slightly, her voice soft. Sir, I just wanted to check if there's anything else you need, she said, her kindness a stark contrast to Linda's earlier behavior. Elliot looked up, his expression softening at her sincerity. Thank you, Rachel. I'm fine for now, he said, his tone warm but measured. The subtle use of her name caught her off guard, and she smiled briefly before stepping away to continue her duties. Linda, watching from a distance, stiffened visibly at the exchange. Her irritation was becoming harder to mask, and it wasn't long before she made her next move. As she passed by Elliot's seat, she stopped abruptly, her gaze flickering toward him. I've spoken with the head flight attendant, Linda announced, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. They'll be coming to address the seating arrangement shortly. The statement hung in the air like a challenge, drawing more curious stares from the surrounding passengers. Elliot's calm remained unshaken as he set down his tablet and folded his hands neatly in his lap. Is there an issue with my seat, Ms. Carson? He asked, his voice polite but firm, deliberately using her name for emphasis. Linda's lips tightened, her attempt at authority faltering for a brief moment. We just need to confirm everything is in order, she said, avoiding his gaze. Before she could continue, the head flight attendant, a tall man with a commanding presence, appeared from the galley. His name tag read, Jonathan, and his expression was neutral but professional. He glanced between Linda and Elliot, clearly aware that the situation had already drawn significant attention. "Mr. Parker, I apologize for any inconvenience," Jonathan began, addressing Elliot directly. "Is there something I can assist you with?" Elliot tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze unwavering. "It seems there's been some confusion about my seat," he said evenly. "I'd like to understand what the concern is." Jonathan turned to Linda, his brow furrowing slightly. "Ms. Carson, could you clarify the issue here?" Linda hesitated, her confidence visibly wavering under the scrutiny. I was just ensuring the seating arrangement matched the passenger list," she said quickly, though her tone lacked its earlier assertiveness. Jonathan frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Mr. Parker's ticket was scanned and verified at boarding," he said, his voice firm. "There's no reason for further checks." Linda opened her mouth as if to argue, but the stern look Jonathan gave her silenced her immediately. Around them, the tension in the cabin grew thicker as passengers watched the scene unfold. Elliot gave a small nod of acknowledgement to Jonathan. "Thank you for clarifying," he said simply. Then, turning his attention back to Linda, he added, "I hope this resolves any further confusion." The quiet authority in his tone left no room for argument. Linda's face reddened slightly as she muttered a strained apology before retreating to the galley. Jonathan, meanwhile, remained composed as he offered Elliot a slight nod before stepping away. As the cabin settled into an uneasy silence, Elliot picked up his tablet once more, his calm exterior unchanged. But beneath the surface, the gears of his mind were already turning. He had stayed silent long enough, and it was time to act. With a few precise taps on his tablet, he opened a messaging app and began typing. The message was brief, but it carried weight. When he hit send, his expression remained calm, but a faint flicker of resolve glinted in his eyes. Linda, still in the galley, couldn't shake the growing unease that had settled over her. She glanced nervously toward the first-class cabin, where Elliot sat quietly, his calm demeanor more unsettling than any outburst could have been. She didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had already begun to shift. The plane cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet, but the tension in the first-class cabin felt anything but calm. Elliot remained seated, his posture composed and his tablet resting on his lap. His earlier message had been sent, and now he waited, exuding an air of quiet patience that seemed to unsettle even the most inattentive passengers. Linda's footsteps echoed faintly as she moved through the galley. She avoided the first-class cabin entirely, her interactions with the other flight attendants curt and distracted. Rachel noticed her demeanor, and sensing something was amiss, cautiously approached her in the galley. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked gently, placing a hand on the counter. "You've seemed off since takeoff." Linda stiffened and shook her head. "I'm fine," she snapped, though her tone betrayed her unease. "It's just, some passengers think they're above the rules, that's all." Rachel frowned, her concern deepening. "What rules?" she asked. "Everyone up here has a valid ticket. What's going on?" Linda didn't answer. Instead, she busied herself with rearranging the drink cart, though her hands trembled slightly. Rachel glanced toward the first-class cabin, her gaze lingering on Elliot, who sat calmly at his seat. The disconnect between his composed demeanor and Linda's growing tension was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Elliot's phone vibrated softly in his pocket. He retrieved it, glancing at the screen with a faint look of satisfaction. The reply was swift and concise. "All set. Details confirmed." Elliot placed his phone back into his pocket and leaned back in his seat, his expression as serene as ever. Around him, the whispers from other passengers grew louder, and the man across the aisle leaned forward again. "Whatever's going on, it's got her completely rattled," he said, nodding toward the galley where Linda had disappeared. "Are you sure you're all right?" Elliot gave him a small, reassuring smile. "I appreciate your concern," he said. Everything will be sorted out soon." Before the man could reply, the intercom crackled to life. The pilot's voice, calm and steady, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. Please continue to enjoy your flight, and don't hesitate to let our crew know if you need any assistance." The announcement was routine, but Linda, still in the galley, froze as the overhead phone buzzed immediately after. Her hesitation lasted only a moment before she picked up the receiver. "This is Linda," she said, her voice tight. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline's executive office. We've been alerted to a potential issue regarding a first-class passenger. Can you confirm the nature of the problem?" Linda's heart sank. Her fingers tightened around the receiver as she stumbled through her words. "It's a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "Nothing serious." The voice on the other end didn't waver. "We're monitoring the situation closely. Ensure all passengers are treated respectfully. Any further incidents will be escalated." The call ended before Linda could respond, leaving her gripping the phone in silence. Her stomach churned as she replayed the conversation in her mind. She turned to look at the first-class cabin through the small gap in the galley curtain. Elliot remained seated, unbothered, his calm gaze fixed out the window. Linda set the phone down with trembling hands. She could feel the walls closing in, but she wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. Gathering her composure, she stepped back into the cabin, determined to reassert control. But as she walked down the aisle, the weight of the unseen power at play began to press heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something she couldn't control. Linda moved through the first-class cabin with deliberate steps, her forced smile thin and brittle. Passengers watched her with a mixture of curiosity and unease, their earlier whispers now full-blown murmurs. She pretended not to notice, focusing instead on maintaining the facade of control. But deep down, her confidence had begun to erode. Elliot sat motionless, his calm gaze tracking her subtle movements. He didn't say a word, nor did he give her any indication of what might be on his mind. Yet his silence seemed louder than anything she could have said. It was unnerving, and it left Linda feeling like the ground beneath her was slowly crumbling. As she approached his row, she hesitated for a fraction of a second before addressing him. "Mr. Parker, is there anything else I can assist you with?" she asked, her voice overly polite, almost saccharine. The words felt like an olive branch, though the tone betrayed her growing unease. Elliot's response was measured. "No, thank you," he said, his voice steady and polite. He looked at her directly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension radiating from her. "I'm quite comfortable now." Linda nodded stiffly and moved on, her steps quicker than before. As she returned to the galley, she muttered under her breath, frustration and anxiety bubbling to the surface. Rachel caught the tail end of her words and frowned, her concern deepening. "You're really on edge," Rachel said, stepping closer to Linda in the galley. "What's going on? If there's an issue, maybe we should talk to Jonathan." Linda's head snapped up, her eyes sharp with defensiveness. "There's no issue," she snapped. "I'm handling it." Rachel raised her hands in a placating gesture. "Okay," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe her. She glanced toward the first-class cabin again, her gaze landing on Elliot. "He doesn't seem like the type to cause trouble." Linda let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "You don't know what people like that are capable of," she muttered under her breath, but the words felt hollow even to her. Meanwhile, Elliot's phone buzzed again. He pulled it out discreetly, glancing at the screen. The message was short and direct. "Confirmation received. Action underway." A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. He adjusted his posture, sitting a little straighter, as if preparing for what was to come. It wasn't long before the overhead phone in the galley buzzed again. Linda froze at the sound, her stomach tightening. Rachel exchanged a glance with her before stepping aside, letting Linda answer. "This is Linda," she said, her voice strained. "Linda, this is the captain," came the calm, authoritative voice on the other end. I need you to report to the galley immediately. Bring Jonathan with you." Linda's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, Captain," she managed to say before hanging up. She turned to Rachel, her face pale. "Take over for me," she said, her voice tight. Rachel frowned but nodded, stepping into the aisle to continue the service. Linda, meanwhile, hurried to the galley where Jonathan was already waiting, his arms crossed and his expression serious. "What's going on?" Jonathan asked, his tone brisk. Before Linda could respond, the captain's voice came through the intercom in the galley. "We've received communication from the executive office regarding a significant matter involving a passenger in first class. Linda, I need you to provide a full explanation of your actions." The blood drained from Linda's face as she realized the weight of what was happening. Jonathan's gaze hardened, and he gestured for her to speak. I thought there was an issue with his seat," Linda stammered. "I was just trying to ensure everything was in order." Jonathan's expression darkened. "And you didn't think to verify that before creating a scene? You've been drawing unnecessary attention since takeoff." "I didn't mean for it to escalate," Linda said quickly, her voice shaking. Jonathan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You need to fix this now." Linda nodded, her breath shallow as she braced herself. But deep down, she knew this was no longer a problem she could fix with a simple apology. Something bigger was unfolding, and she was losing control with every passing moment. The tension in the first-class cabin seemed to thicken with every passing second. Linda, pale and visibly rattled, emerged from the galley with Jonathan following closely behind. The usual air of authority she carried was gone, replaced by hesitation and uncertainty. Passengers exchanged curious glances, their whispers growing louder. It was clear to everyone that something was happening, but the full extent of the unfolding drama was known only to a few. Elliot remained composed, sitting tall in his seat with his hands resting calmly on his lap. His steady demeanor only added to the mystery surrounding him, drawing the attention of passengers who had previously kept to themselves. Across the aisle, the man who had been observing earlier leaned forward again, whispering, "Looks like you've got the whole crew in a frenzy. You sure you're okay?" Elliot glanced at him briefly and gave a faint smile. "I appreciate your concern," he said quietly, his tone measured and calm. "Let's just say everything is under control." Linda approached cautiously, her earlier confidence completely eroded. She stopped in front of Elliot's seat, clasping her hands tightly in front of her as if trying to steady herself. Jonathan stood a few steps behind her, his stern gaze silently urging her to proceed. "Mr. Parker," Linda began, her voice strained but attempting politeness, "I'd like to apologize if there's been any misunderstanding about your seat or the service you've received." Elliot tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze meeting hers. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice soft but sharp enough to make her flinch. "That's an interesting way to put it." Linda swallowed hard, glancing at Jonathan for support, but he offered none. "I may have been mistaken in my judgment earlier," she stammered. "I want to assure you that it wasn't intentional." The tension in the cabin was almost tangible. Nearby passengers leaned in slightly, their curiosity overtaking any sense of decorum. Linda's words hung in the air, but Elliot made no immediate reply. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a calm and deliberate tone, he said, "Apologies are a start, Miss Carson, but they don't address the real issue, do they?" Linda's face flushed with embarrassment, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Before she could collect herself, Jonathan stepped forward. "Mr. Parker, on behalf of the crew and the airline, I'd like to extend our sincerest apologies for any discomfort or disrespect you've experienced. Please know that this matter will be reported and handled appropriately." Elliot nodded slightly, acknowledging Jonathan's words, though his calm expression remained unchanged. "I appreciate your professionalism," he said, "though I suspect this matter has already gone beyond what you can handle here." Jonathan frowned slightly, his confusion evident. "I'm not sure I understand, sir." Elliot leaned back in his seat, his composed demeanor unshaken. "You will soon," he replied, his tone calm but carrying a weight that made Jonathan pause. As if on cue, the overhead phone in the galley buzzed again. Rachel, who had been quietly observing from a distance, stepped forward to answer it. Her expression shifted quickly from neutral curiosity to wide-eyed surprise as she listened. After a brief moment, she hung up and turned toward Jonathan, her voice low but urgent. "You need to come to the cockpit," she said. "Now." Jonathan nodded, casting a quick glance at Elliot before following Rachel to the front of the plane. Linda, left behind, looked visibly shaken, her earlier confidence reduced to nervous fidgeting. She avoided meeting Elliot's gaze and instead busied herself with adjusting the tray tables around her, though it was clear her mind was elsewhere. Meanwhile, Elliot remained calm, his hands resting lightly on his lap as he gazed out the window. The clouds rolled by in a serene expanse, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the plane. Passengers whispered among themselves, their curiosity reaching a fever pitch. The man across the aisle couldn't contain himself any longer. "Okay, I've got to ask," he said, leaning toward Elliot. "What's really going on here?" Elliot turned to him, his faint smile returning. "Patience," he said simply. "All will be clear soon." At the front of the plane, Jonathan entered the cockpit, where the captain waited with a phone pressed to his ear. The captain's face was serious as he listened intently to the voice on the other end of the line. When the call ended, he turned to Jonathan, his expression grave. "That was the executive office," the captain said. "Effective immediately, ownership of the airline has changed hands. The new owner is on this flight." Jonathan blinked, his surprise evident. "The new owner?" he asked, though the realization was already beginning to dawn on him. The captain nodded. "Mr. Elliot Parker. I've been instructed to ensure he receives full priority service for the remainder of the flight, and to report any incidents directly to the board." Jonathan's face paled slightly as the weight of the situation sank in. He nodded and left the cockpit, his steps heavy as he made his way back to the first-class cabin. When he returned, he found Linda standing near the galley, her expression still tense. He pulled her aside, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk," he said. "Now." Linda glanced at him nervously, but before she could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to inform you of a significant update. Ownership of the airline has officially transitioned, effective immediately. We will ensure that all passengers continue to have a comfortable and safe journey. Thank you for your attention." The announcement left the cabin in stunned silence. Linda's face went white, her grip tightening on the counter beside her. Elliot, meanwhile, remained seated, his calm expression unchanged as he looked out the window. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place. The first-class cabin buzzed with hushed but urgent whispers after the captain's announcement. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances, their curiosity now mingled with awe and disbelief. Elliot remained motionless in his seat, his calm demeanor unshaken, though his silence seemed louder than any explanation could have been. His presence now carried a weight that had shifted the atmosphere entirely. Every glance from the surrounding passengers lingered on him, their expressions filled with speculation. Linda stood frozen in the galley, her face pale and her breath shallow. The captain's announcement had struck her like a thunderclap. Ownership transition, new owner, and on this flight? The realization began to creep in, slow and suffocating. She turned toward Jonathan, who had just returned from the cockpit. His face was grim as he gestured for her to follow him into the galley, away from the passengers' watchful eyes. "Jonathan, what's going on?" Linda asked, her voice trembling as she followed him. Jonathan didn't reply immediately. He folded his arms and leaned against the counter, his jaw tight. "I just spoke with the captain," he said after a pause. "The executive office confirmed that the airline has been sold, effective immediately, and the new owner is here on this flight." Linda's heart sank, her mind racing as she struggled to process his words. "Who?" she asked, though the dread growing in her chest already hinted at the answer. Jonathan's gaze hardened. Mr. Elliot Parker. Linda's breath caught. The name hit her like a punch to the stomach. She gripped the edge of the counter for support as the pieces began to fall into place. The calm man in the first-class seat, the quiet authority in his tone, the way he had handled her condescension without so much as raising his voice. It all made sense now. He wasn't just another passenger. He was the new owner of the entire airline. Jonathan's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. I don't know what happened between you and Mr. Parker, but the executive office has already flagged this flight. They've been monitoring everything. Whatever you've done, you'd better hope it's not as bad as it sounds. Linda tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her chest tightened as she thought back to every interaction she'd had with Elliot since the beginning of the flight. Her dismissive tone, the pointed comments about fitting in, skipping him during service. It was all rushing back to her in sharp detail, and the weight of her actions felt crushing. Jonathan, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but he held up a hand to stop her. Save it, he said, his tone cold. This is beyond me now. You need to think about how you're going to explain yourself when we land. Because trust me, you will be explaining yourself. Linda's stomach churned as Jonathan walked away, leaving her alone in the galley. She leaned heavily against the counter, her mind spinning. For the first time, she realized the full extent of her mistake. This wasn't just about a poor decision or a lapse in judgment. She had underestimated the wrong person, and now she was paying the price. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, the murmurs continued as passengers pieced together what they could from the announcement and Linda's visible distress. The man across the aisle from Elliot couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. Leaning closer, he whispered, "You're the new owner, aren't you?" Elliot turned his head slightly, meeting the man's gaze. His faint smile didn't confirm or deny the question, but the look in his eyes was answer enough. The man sat back in his seat, his expression shifting from curiosity to respect. Around them, the whispers grew quieter, as if the sheer gravity of the situation had silenced the cabin. Rachel, who had been observing the unfolding drama from a distance, approached Elliot with a soft smile. "Mr. Parker," she said gently, "is there anything I can get you? Anything you need?" Elliot looked up at her, his expression warm but measured. "Thank you, Rachel," he said. "I'm fine for now. You've been very professional." Rachel blushed slightly at the compliment and nodded. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know," she said before stepping away, her gaze flickering briefly toward Linda in the galley. The contrast between the two attendants couldn't have been clearer. As the plane continued its flight, the tension that had been brewing since takeoff reached its peak. Linda remained in the galley, her nerves frayed as she rehearsed possible excuses and explanations in her mind. But deep down, she knew there was no justification that would undo what she had done. Elliot, on the other hand, remained calm and collected. He took out his phone and typed another brief message, sending it with the same quiet confidence he had displayed throughout the flight. A moment later, his phone vibrated with a reply. "Confirmed. Ground team will meet you upon arrival." The faintest hint of a smile crossed Elliot's lips as he placed his phone back in his pocket. The wheels had already been set in motion, and he didn't need to say or do anything further. The situation had reached a point where it would resolve itself, and Elliot was content to let it play out. The passengers, sensing the tension but still unsure of the full story, kept their whispers low and their gazes cautious. The flight continued its smooth trajectory, but for Linda, every minute felt like an eternity. Her hands shook as she clung to the counter in the galley, dreading what awaited her when the plane finally touched down. Elliot, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. His calm expression betrayed no trace of anger or malice, just quiet resolve. Whatever was coming next, he was ready. And for Linda, the realization that she was entirely unprepared made the waiting all the more unbearable. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew increasingly tense as the flight neared its destination. Passengers, though hushed, cast curious and speculative glances toward Elliot, while Linda remained hidden in the galley. Her absence was conspicuous, and the stark contrast between her earlier confidence and current silence didn't go unnoticed. Rachel continued her rounds with quiet efficiency, her demeanor professional and calm, yet even she couldn't entirely mask the unease that lingered in the air. Elliot remained composed, the faint glow of his tablet illuminating his face as he scrolled through documents. To an observer, he might have appeared indifferent to the events around him, but the occasional subtle glance toward his phone suggested otherwise. Each vibration of the device seemed to mark another step forward, in a plan that only he fully understood. In the galley, Linda's mind raced as she clutched the counter for support. Her breathing was shallow, her palms clammy. She had made plenty of mistakes in her career, but none that carried stakes this high. The weight of Jonathan's warning and the captain's announcement hung over her like a storm cloud. Every interaction with Elliot replayed in her mind, and with each recollection, her stomach twisted further. She had tried to assert authority, to maintain control, but now it was clear that she had grossly misjudged not just the situation, but the man at the center of it. Jonathan entered the galley, his expression a mix of disappointment and frustration. He crossed his arms and stared at Linda, his voice low to avoid drawing further attention. "You've put us in a terrible position," he said bluntly. "Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Linda opened her mouth to respond, but her words faltered under the weight of his glare. I didn't know who he was," she stammered. You thought wrong," Jonathan cut her off, his tone sharp. "This isn't about who he is. It's about how you treated him. First-class passengers expect professionalism and respect, no matter what. That's our job, Linda, and you failed." Linda's face flushed with shame as she looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," she said weakly. Jonathan shook his head, his disappointment evident. "Intent doesn't matter. Perception does. And right now, the perception is that you singled out a passenger unfairly. That reflects on all of us, not just you." Before Linda could respond, the overhead intercom chimed. The captain's calm voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, and your tray tables are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The announcement sent a ripple of activity through the plane. Passengers adjusted their seats and stowed their belongings, the normal bustle of preparation blending uneasily with the lingering tension. Linda remained frozen in the galley, her pulse racing as the realization dawned that her time to act, or explain herself, was running out. In the first-class cabin, Elliot calmly powered off his tablet and placed it in his briefcase. He adjusted his seatbelt, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Around him, passengers continued to exchange glances, their curiosity only growing as the plane descended. The man across the aisle leaned forward once again, unable to contain himself any longer. "So, are you going to tell us what's going on?" he asked, his voice low but eager. Elliot turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Soon," he replied simply, his tone polite but firm. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels skimming the runway before easing into a gentle stop. The passengers let out a collective sigh of relief, but the tension in the first-class cabin remained as heavy as ever. The seatbelt sign clicked off and passengers began gathering their belongings, though their movements were slower, almost hesitant, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Elliot stayed seated, his calm gaze fixed on the aisle ahead. He made no move to stand or retrieve his briefcase. Instead, he pulled out his phone and typed a quick message, his expression serene. The message sent with a soft chime, and he placed the phone back in his pocket, his hands resting lightly on his lap. Linda, still in the galley, peeked through the curtain, her breath hitching when her eyes landed on Elliot. He hadn't moved, but his presence felt overwhelming. She turned to Jonathan, her voice trembling. "What do I do now?" Jonathan gave her a hard look. "You wait, and you take responsibility for whatever's coming." As the passengers filed out of the first-class cabin, a group of airline personnel gathered just beyond the jet bridge, their crisp uniforms and serious expressions, signaling that they were waiting for someone important. The sight made Linda's stomach drop. She knew without a doubt that they weren't here for a routine inspection. Elliot stood slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. He retrieved his briefcase and adjusted his jacket before stepping into the aisle. As he made his way toward the exit, the remaining passengers watched in silence, their curiosity now mingled with awe. When he reached the door, Linda couldn't avoid his gaze any longer. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, her face paled, her breath catching in her throat. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Parker," Jonathan said, his voice steady but tinged with respect. Elliot paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on Linda. "I hope today serves as a lesson," he said quietly, his tone firm but devoid of anger. "Respect is not optional." With that, he stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge, leaving Linda standing frozen in place. The airline personnel greeted him with deference, their voices low as they ushered him toward the terminal. Linda remained rooted to the spot, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy cloud. As Elliot walked through the terminal, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and smiled faintly, before tucking it back into his pocket. The gears of accountability were already in motion, and he didn't need to look back to know that everything was unfolding as planned. For Linda, the landing was only the beginning of a far more turbulent journey ahead. The terminal buzzed with its usual hum of activity as passengers from the flight disembarked and hurried to their destinations. But the group of airline personnel gathered near the gate added an unusual weight to the scene. Their neatly pressed uniforms and composed expressions barely masked the tension in their posture as they awaited Elliot Parker's arrival. Among them was a senior executive, Mr. Harris, whose anxious glances toward the jet bridge betrayed his attempt at professionalism. Elliot stepped onto the jet bridge with the same calm, deliberate demeanor he had maintained throughout the flight. His presence immediately commanded attention. The personnel straightened instinctively, their gazes fixed on him as he approached. Harris stepped forward, extending a hand. "Mr. Parker," Harris said, his tone respectful but edged with tension. "Welcome back. We've been briefed and we're here to ensure everything is handled appropriately." Elliot shook his hand firmly, his expression measured. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. I trust that the board has been made aware of the events on this flight?" "They have," Harris confirmed, his voice careful. "The necessary steps are already underway. The crew involved will be debriefed immediately, and we've prepared a private space for you to provide any additional feedback." Elliot nodded, but said nothing more, his gaze shifting momentarily to the bustling terminal beyond. He didn't need to press the issue. His presence alone was enough to ensure action. Without another word, he followed Harris and the group of personnel toward a discreet meeting room tucked away from the public areas. Back on the plane, Linda remained in the galley, her legs feeling like lead as she stared blankly at the floor. The passengers were gone, and the cabin was quiet, but the silence only amplified her growing dread. Jonathan stood nearby, his arms crossed as he watched her with a mix of frustration and pity. "They're waiting for you," he said finally, his tone devoid of sympathy. Linda looked up at him, her face pale. "Do you think they'll fire me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan's expression hardened. "I think you're asking the wrong question," he said. "You should be asking yourself how you let it get this far." Linda flinched at his words but didn't argue. She knew he was right. Her actions had been reckless, driven by assumptions and biases she hadn't even realized she held. Now those actions were catching up to her, and there was no escaping the consequences. "Come on," Jonathan said, his voice softer this time. "Let's get this over with." He led Linda off the plane and through the terminal, where two members of the airline's HR team were waiting for her. Their expressions were neutral but professional, and their presence alone made Linda's stomach churn. "Ms. Carson," one of them said, addressing her directly, "we'll be conducting a preliminary debrief regarding the events of today's flight. Please follow us." Linda nodded weakly, her legs shaking as she followed them toward a nearby conference room. Jonathan watched her go, his expression unreadable, before turning back toward the plane to oversee the final cleanup. Meanwhile, Elliot was seated in the private meeting room with Mr. Harris and two other senior executives. The room was quiet, the atmosphere serious but professional. Harris cleared his throat before speaking. "Mr. Parker, I want to personally apologize on behalf of the airline for the unacceptable treatment you experienced," he began. "This does not reflect our values, and I assure you that we are taking immediate steps to address the situation." Elliot listened silently, his gaze steady but piercing. When Harris finished, Elliot leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Apologies are a start," he said, "but they're not enough. This isn't just about one employee's actions. It's about the culture that allowed it to happen." Harris nodded quickly, his expression contrite. "You're absolutely right. That's why we've already initiated a review of our training programs and policies. Sensitivity training will be mandatory for all employees, and we're implementing new protocols to ensure incidents like this are reported and addressed immediately." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "And what about accountability?" he asked. "How will you ensure that the lessons learned here are applied consistently across all levels of the organization?" Harris hesitated, glancing briefly at the other executives before replying. "We're committed to full transparency," he said. "A detailed report of today's events will be submitted to the board, and we'll provide regular updates on the progress of these initiatives." Elliot's gaze didn't waver. "I'll expect to review those reports personally," he said. "This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that every passenger, regardless of their background, is treated with respect and dignity." "Of course," Harris said quickly. "You have our full commitment." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes with Elliot outlining his expectations and the executives taking meticulous notes. When it concluded, Harris stood and extended his hand again. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Parker," he said. "We'll ensure this matter is resolved appropriately." Elliot shook his hand firmly, but didn't linger. As he exited the meeting room and stepped back into the terminal, his phone buzzed with another message. He glanced at the screen briefly before slipping it into his pocket, his expression calm but resolute. Outside the terminal, a sleek black car waited for him at the curb. The driver stepped forward to open the door, greeting him with a respectful nod. "Everything is ready, sir," the driver said. Elliot nodded and slid into the back seat, the door closing with a soft thud. As the car pulled away from the terminal, he gazed out the window, his thoughts calm and focused. The events of the day had been a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, but they had also reinforced his belief in the power of accountability and action. Back inside the terminal, Linda sat in the HR conference room, her hands trembling as she recounted her version of the events. The HR representatives listened carefully, their expressions professional but unyielding. Linda's voice faltered as she realized that no explanation she gave could undo the damage that had been done. For both Elliot and Linda, the flight had been a turning point, one that would shape not just their own paths, but the culture of the airline itself. The HR conference room was stifling. Linda sat at the end of the long table, her palms damp as she gripped the arms of her chair. Across from her, the two HR representatives remained professional but firm, their presence amplifying the suffocating tension. A recorder on the table captured every word she said, and the silence after each of her faltering explanations felt more damning than any outright accusation. "I didn't mean to offend him," Linda said, her voice trembling. "I was just trying to follow protocol to make sure everything was in order." The older of the two representatives, a composed woman with sharp glasses, looked up from her notes. "Ms. Carson, multiple witnesses have corroborated that Mr. Parker's ticket was verified at boarding. There was no protocol-based reason for your actions. Do you have another explanation?" Linda's mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of her decisions crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Her justifications, so flimsy even in her own mind, now seemed indefensible under the scrutinizing gaze of the airline's representatives. The younger representative, a man who had been quietly taking notes, spoke next. This isn't just about one incident, he said calmly. It's about how your behavior reflects on our organization. Mr. Parker is not only a passenger, he is now the owner of this airline. Your actions today have far-reaching consequences, both for you and for the company as a whole. Linda felt her stomach twist. The mention of Elliot's ownership, though something she had known for the past hour, hit her again with fresh impact. The very person she had disrespected was now in charge of the airline. There was no salvaging her position. She could feel it in the icy finality of the HR representative's tones. Meanwhile, in a private terminal lounge, Elliot sat calmly, sipping a glass of water as he reviewed his notes. His phone buzzed softly, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Mr. Harris. "Debrief with Ms. Carson is underway. Full report will follow." Elliot responded with a short reply. "Keep me updated. Ensure necessary changes are implemented." He placed the phone aside and leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. He wasn't a man driven by revenge. This was never about humiliating Linda or watching her fall. It was about something bigger, ensuring that the culture of the airline reflected the values it claimed to uphold. He had no interest in theatrics or personal vendettas. What he wanted was systemic change. Back in the HR room, Linda's debrief dragged on, each question cutting deeper into her already shaky defenses. "Do you believe your actions today aligned with the airline's core values of inclusivity and respect?" the older representative asked, her tone unyielding. Linda hesitated, her throat dry. I suppose not," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The representative set her pen down, her expression unreadable. "We'll be forwarding our findings to the disciplinary committee. For now, you are relieved of your duties. You will be notified of their decision in writing." Linda's breath hitched. "So, that's it?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "I don't even get a chance to explain myself further?" The younger representative raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Carson, you've had ample opportunity to provide context. The facts are clear, and Mr. Parker's account is supported by multiple witnesses. This is no longer a matter of explanation. It's a matter of accountability." Linda's shoulders slumped as the finality of their words settled over her. Her career, one she had worked for years to build, was effectively over. The HR representative stood, signaling that the meeting had concluded. Linda sat frozen for a moment, her mind blank, before shakily rising to her feet. As she exited the room, her thoughts raced. Regret, shame, and anger swirled in her mind, each emotion vying for dominance, but one thought stood out above the rest. She had underestimated Elliot Parker, and it had cost her everything. Outside, Elliot's car waited by the curb. He stepped in gracefully, nodding to the driver. As the car pulled away, he glanced at his phone again. Another message from Harris appeared. Linda Carson's employment under review. Full disciplinary committee meeting scheduled. Policy changes in progress. Elliot allowed himself a faint smile. It wasn't satisfaction. It was relief. The wheels were in motion, and the changes he had envisioned were beginning to take shape. The events of the day had been challenging, but they had sparked something larger than him or Linda. The airline was on a path toward reform, and he would ensure it stayed that way. In her small apartment later that evening, Linda sat at her kitchen table staring blankly at the termination notice she had received. The paper felt heavier than it should, its words stark and unyielding. Her phone buzzed with messages from co-workers and friends, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. The humiliation and regret were too fresh, too raw. At the same time, Elliot sat in his office, the city lights casting long shadows across his desk. He reviewed the airline's existing policies and drafted notes for the next board meeting. His focus wasn't on Linda anymore. Her actions had been a symptom of a larger issue. His real work lay in dismantling the systemic biases that had allowed such behavior to flourish. For Linda, the day marked the end of her career. For Elliot, it marked the beginning of something far greater. The ripple effects of their shared flight were only just beginning to unfold, setting the stage for a transformation that would leave no part of the airline untouched. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city, Elliot sat in a private conference room at the airline's corporate headquarters. He had requested an emergency meeting with the board of directors to discuss immediate reforms. The directors, a mix of seasoned professionals and younger executives, looked visibly tense. The events of the day had reached them in real time, and they understood the gravity of the situation. Elliot, however, exuded calm authority. His tailored suit was impeccable, his demeanor collected. In front of him lay a neatly organized file containing detailed reports, the airline's policies, and notes he had made over the course of the day. As the meeting began, he leaned forward, addressing the room with a measured tone. "Let me be clear," Elliot began, his voice steady but firm. "Today's incident wasn't an isolated event. It's a symptom of deeper issues within this organization, issues that must be addressed immediately." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, an older man named Mr. Calloway, cleared his throat. "Mr. Parker, we deeply regret what happened on your flight. It's unacceptable, and we're committed to making things right." Elliot's gaze didn't waver. "Regret is a starting point," he said. "But regret without action is meaningless. I want a detailed plan for comprehensive sensitivity and bias training rolled out across all levels of the organization within the next 60 days. Another director, a woman named Ms. Alvarez, nodded. "We can draft an outline and bring in consultants to expedite the process," she said. "This is a priority." Elliot continued, his voice calm but resolute. "It's not just about training. This company needs stronger accountability measures. Employees need to know that discriminatory behavior, intentional or not, will not be tolerated. That means clear protocols, better reporting systems, and visible consequences for violations." Calloway nodded, though his discomfort was apparent. "We'll ensure those measures are in place," he said. "But if I may, Mr. Parker, I think it's also important to address public perception. The media could seize on this incident if we're not careful." Elliot's eyes sharpened. "Public perception is important, but it's secondary to substance. If this organization focuses only on optics, it will fail. The goal isn't to manage the narrative, it's to change the culture." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Alvarez broke the silence. "He's right. If we make these changes superficial, they'll unravel the moment scrutiny fades. We need something lasting." Elliot nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Exactly. This is about more than damage control. It's about setting a standard, not just for this airline, but for the industry as a whole." The discussion continued for another hour, with Elliot outlining his vision and the board members brainstorming implementation strategies. By the time the meeting concluded, there was a palpable shift in the room. The tension had given way to determination, and Elliot's vision was beginning to take shape. As the directors filed out, Ms. Alvarez lingered behind. She approached Elliot with a thoughtful expression. "You handled today with remarkable composure," she said. "Many people in your position would have demanded retribution, but you focused on the bigger picture." Elliot offered a small smile. "Retribution doesn't fix systemic problems," he said. "Change does." Alvarez nodded, her respect evident. "I think you're going to transform this place." "That's the goal," Elliot replied simply. Meanwhile, in her apartment across the city, Linda sat slumped on her couch, staring blankly at her television. The news was on, though she wasn't paying attention. Headlines about workplace bias and systemic reform flashed across the screen, interspersed with segments about accountability and corporate culture. Each one felt like a jab, a reminder of the day's events. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, but she ignored it. The messages were endless. Some from concerned colleagues, others from friends trying to offer support. But she couldn't bring herself to respond. The weight of her actions and their consequences was too heavy to confront. Finally, she picked up the remote and turned off the television, plunging the room into silence. She stared at the termination letter on the table, the words blurring as tears welled in her eyes. She had spent years building a career she was proud of, only to have it crumble in a single day. And yet, as much as she wanted to blame the circumstances, or Elliot, she couldn't ignore the truth. Her actions had brought this on herself. After a long pause, Linda reached for her laptop. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys before finally opening a new email. The subject line was simple. Apology letter to Mr. Elliot Parker. She began typing, her words halting at first, but gaining momentum as she poured out her regret. She didn't expect forgiveness, nor did she believe her apology would erase what had happened. But it was a start, her first step toward taking responsibility. Back at the corporate headquarters, Elliot stepped out of the building and into the cool evening air. The day had been long, but he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The wheels of change had been set in motion, and while the road ahead would be challenging, he was ready for it. As he entered his car, his phone buzzed with a new notification. It was an email from Linda Carson. The subject line caught his eye, but he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he sat back in his seat, the faint hum of the city around him, and allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Today had been a battle, not against a person, but against a culture of complacency. And though there was still much work to be done, Elliot knew one thing for certain. The fight was worth it. The following morning, the city stirred to life under the soft glow of the rising sun. In a sleek conference room at the airline's headquarters, Elliot prepared to meet the senior leadership team for the first formal step in implementing the sweeping changes he had outlined. The air in the room was heavy with anticipation, as executives shuffled their notes and adjusted their positions. They knew today wasn't business as usual. It was the beginning of a transformation. Elliot entered the room, his presence commanding yet unassuming. He placed a simple notebook on the table, flipped it open, and began with a steady tone. Let's get started. We're not here to talk about what went wrong yesterday. We're here to ensure it doesn't happen again. Not just for me, but for anyone who steps onto one of our planes. The team leaned in, their pens ready, as Elliot spoke with precision. He outlined actionable steps, mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, anonymous feedback mechanisms to empower passengers and staff, and quarterly audits to evaluate progress. He emphasized accountability at every level, ensuring that incidents like what had happened on the flight were addressed swiftly and decisively. This is about culture, Elliot said, his tone resolute. You can build all the policies in the world, but if the culture doesn't change, none of it will matter. That starts here, with us. The room was silent for a moment before Ms. Alvarez, now leading the reform committee, nodded. We're behind you, Mr. Parker. This will set a new standard for the industry. After the meeting concluded, Elliot returned to his office and finally opened the email from Linda Carson. Her words were contrite, full of regret and a raw honesty he hadn't expected. She acknowledged her biases and the harm they had caused, expressing her intent to learn and grow from the experience. The message ended with a simple, yet sincere line. Thank you for holding me accountable. Elliot stared at the screen for a moment before drafting a reply. His response was brief but firm. Accountability is the first step. Growth is the next. I hope you take this experience and use it to create positive change, wherever your path leads. With a click, he sent the email and closed his laptop. He didn't dwell on it. His focus was already on the future. Across the city, Linda sat in her small apartment, staring at the notification that Elliot had replied. She read his words twice, her emotions swirling between relief and determination. For the first time since the incident, she felt a glimmer of hope. Not for her old job, but for herself. She opened her notebook and began writing down ideas for how she could rebuild, not just her career, but her character. A few weeks later, changes at the airline became evident. Training sessions were held, reporting structures were revamped, and employee satisfaction surveys reflected a noticeable shift in morale. Passengers started noticing the difference too, Smiles from staff felt genuine, assistance was prompt, and the service exuded a new professionalism. Stories of these changes spread, even reaching the media, who praised the airline's efforts under its new ownership. One day, during a routine flight inspection, Elliot walked through the terminal unnoticed by most travelers. But as he neared the gate, a young flight attendant approached him hesitantly. It was Rachel, the kind attendant from his flight. "Mr. Parker," she said, her voice warm. "I just wanted to say thank you. Things are so much better now, for all of us." Elliot smiled, his expression genuine. "That means more than you know," he replied. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Elliot sat by the window, gazing at the expanse of sky ahead. The journey to reform was far from over, but he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing they were on the right path. For Elliot, the sky wasn't a limit. It was a horizon, always stretching further, always filled with possibilities. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.